Dear students, myself Dr. Narendra Ryali, Assistant Professor PG Department of Commerce and Management Studies, VSM College Autonomous, Ramachandrapuram. I am here to explain you on the concepts of macroeconomics inflation. In my earlier video, you have understood what is national income and also its aggregates as well as measurement. Now, in this video, let us learn about another macroeconomic concept, that is inflation. Another macroeconomic concept, this concept is known as inflation. So let us first try to understand what is inflation. Inflation is a worldwide phenomena. Throughout the history of mankind, prices have been rising, maybe due to war or a famine and natural calamities, etc. In the present age, the population of every country is increasing, and every country has to spend more and more on the development of its resources. In order to face market competition as well as to meet the growing demands of higher standard involving the expenditure often exceeds the financial resources of a country. Therefore, hence the money supply has to be increased either by internal or external credits or by printing more currency notes. As the investment does not yield the immediate result, there is no proportionate increase in goods and services. While, on the other hand, demand keeps on rising due to the increase in income and wages. Hence, too much money chases too few goods, and the general price level keeps on rising. Too much money chases too few goods. Too much money chases too much money chases too few goods. Therefore, the general price level keeps on increasing. Inflation is a rise in the general level of prices of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. When the general price level rises, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. Therefore, inflation reflects an erosion of purchasing power of money. Now, let us understand what exactly the meaning and definition of inflation. What about the exact meaning and definition of inflation? According to Crowther, According to Crowther, inflation is a state in which the value of money is falling, that is, the prices are rising. Inflation is a state in which the value of money is falling, that is, the prices are rising. This definition was given by Crowther. In a similar way, Milton Friedman said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. John Maynard Keynes, inflation is the result of the excess of aggregate demand over the available aggregate supply, and true inflation starts only after full employment. Also, according to Silverman, inflation is the name given to the expansion of money supplies, whether in currency or credit, in the excess of the amount justified by the government for trade. So, but after seeing the definitions of inflation, now inflation is inevitable like death is saying of one of the economists. It can also be defined as a state of disequilibrium between the purchasing power which is increasing and the output of goods and services which is not increasing at a corresponding rate. That is, but for a common man in the street, it may mean that a process of hiking prices. Inflation is, in essence, implies too much too much money chasing the too much money chasing too few goods. Types of inflation. Crowther. So now let us understand different types of inflation. Basic by now you have been introduced to what is inflation. It refers to the persistent upward movement of the general price level and results in the decline of purchasing power. There is a flow of excessive money in the economy that creates excess demand in the market compared to the supply, and as a result the producers mark higher prices for the goods and services and overall rise of price of various goods. Now let us understand different types of inflation. Let us first one is inflation based on coverage. Let us understand the classification or types of inflation. First one, based on coverage. Based on coverage, there are two types: comprehensive inflation and Spartiak inflation. Comprehensive means when the prices of all commodities rise throughout the economy, it is known as comprehensive. Another name for comprehensive inflation is economy wide inflation. Spartiak inflation, when the prices of only few commodities in few regions or areas rise, it is known as Spartiak. For example, rise in food prices due to bad monsoon, wind bringing seasonal rains in India, like that. So in certain areas we see the price in prices due to seasonal conditions, like that. In such cases we call them as Spartiak inflation. And the second classification is based on time of time of occurrence. Here you have three types: wartime, inflation, post war inflation, peacetime inflation. Wartime inflation, here this takes place during the war-like situation. During a war, scarce productive resources are all diverted and prioritized to produce military goods and equipments. So this overall result in very limited supply and our extreme shortage. Second one, post-war inflation. This takes place soon after the war has been completed. After the war, government controls are relaxed, resulting in faster hikes in prices than what experienced during the war. And then last one is peacetime inflation. When prices are rising during a normal period, it is known as peacetime inflation. It is due to huge government expenditure or spending on capital projects of a long gestation period, that is long development period. Inflation, the next category is third category, inflation based on government reaction. Based on government reaction, yes. Based on government reaction, you have two types: open inflation, suppressed inflation. Open inflation, when the government does not attempt to restrict inflation, it is known as open inflation. In a free market economy where prices are allowed to take its own course, that is known as open inflation. In this situation, government will not try to reduce the prices. Next one is suppressed inflation. Yes, when the government prevents the price rise through the price controls like rations, etc., it is known as suppressed inflation. It is also referred as repressed inflation. However, when the government controls are removed, the suppressed inflation becomes open inflation. So this leads to corruption, black marketing, artificial scarcity, etc. And the next one, types of inflation based on Types of inflation based on rising prices. Inflation based on rising prices. Here you have creeping inflation, chronic inflation, and walking inflation. Based on the rising prices, inflation is being measured as, or inflation is being classified as creeping inflation, walking inflation, and then chronic inflation. What is creeping inflation? When the prices are gently rising, it is referred to as creeping inflation. It is the mildest form of the inflation and is also known as mild or low inflation. R.P. Kent said that when prices rise by not more than up to 3% per annum, it is called as creeping inflation. Based on the rising prices, you have creeping inflation, walking inflation, chronic inflation, moderate, and the next one is moderate inflation, running inflation, and the finally hyperinflation. Yes. What is creeping inflation? Yeah. When prices are increasing gently, so that is creeping inflation. What is walking inflation? When the rate of rising prices is more than creeping inflation, it is known as walking inflation. So but see, in creeping inflation, it should be pri- prices should be less than 3%. In walking inflation, it should be 3 to 10%. So that is known as walking. And then what is chronic inflation? If creeping inflation persists, continues to increase for a longer period, then this is known as chronic inflation or secular inflation. Chronic creeping inflation can be either continuous or intermittent, which occurs at irregular intervals. It is called chronic because if an inflation rate continues to grow for a longer period without any downturn, it possibly leads to the hyperinflation. And the next one is moderate inflation. Professor Samuelson clubbed together the concept of creeping and walking inflation into the moderate inflation. So, when prices rise less than 10% per annum, it is known as moderate. See, when less than 3%, we call them as creeping. And if creeping is being continued for long term, we call them as chronic. And if rising prices is at the rate of from 3 to 10%, we call them as walking. But here, Professor Samuelson came and gave that if it is less than 10%, we call it whatever it is, we call it as a moderate one. Now, what is about the running inflation? Yes, a rapid acceleration in the rate of rising prices is referred to as running inflation. When the prices rise by more than 10% per annum, running inflation occurs. Though economists have not suggested a fixed range, if it is between the 10% to 20%, we call them as running inflation. And the next one there is galloping, sorry, galloping inflation. Galloping inflation. So, according to Professor Samuelson, if the prices rise by double or triple digit inflation rates like 30 or 400 or 999 etc., so that situation can be like galloping. So, galloping when prices rise by more than 20% but less than 1000%, we call them as galloping inflation. And the next one is hyperinflation. Yes. Hyperinflation refers to a situation where the prices rise at an alarming high rate. The prices rise so fast that it becomes very difficult to measure its magnitude. However, in quantitative terms, when prices rise above 1000% per annum, quadruple or four digit inflation rate, it is also termed as hyperinflation. During a worst scenario of hyperinflation, the value of national currency of an affected country reduces and almost equals to zero. Zimbabwe, yes. Remember the case of Zimbabwe. If you haven't came across the concept or no the case of Zimbabwe, Hungary in the year 1946 and Zimbabwe during 2004 to 2009 under Robert Mugabe's regime, those two countries faced the hyperinflation phase. And the next one is inflation based on fifth category. It is inflation based on causes. In this case, the first one is There will be many causes for the inflation. Let us discuss the important ones. Deficit inflation. It takes place due to deficit financing. And the next one is credit inflation. So this takes place due to excessive bank credit, or yes, excessive bank credit or excessive money supply in the economy. Remember, we don't have adequate money in the country. Remember, getting the RBI printing machine and printing the notes. So thereby the government will supply more money, currency notes into the market. So this is like credit inflation. And the next one is scarcity inflation. Scarcity inflation occurs due to the hoarding. What is this hoarding? Hoarding is an excess accumulation of basic commodities by unscrupulous traders and black marketers. Yes, remember, recently we have been seeing the price hike in the onions and in some other vegetables. What all they do? They will do they will keep their products, with them. They will not release into the market, and thereby creating creating more demand, and later on at a market price, there is at a market price they will in the market they will increase the price. Scarcity inflation. So the next one is profit inflation. What is this profit inflation? Yes, when entrepreneurs are interested in boosting their profit margins, they will increase the prices. So this is known as profit inflation. Pricing power inflation. The next one is pricing power inflation. Yes, it is often referred as administrative price inflation. So it occurs when the industries and business houses increase their prices of their goods and services with an objective to boost their profit margins. We call it as pricing power inflation. Tax inflation. So tax inflation. If you observe in the recent days, most of the electronics, smartphones, laptops, and all, they have been increased. Companies have been increasing their prices. Maybe this is because there are government of India is laying down many of the input taxes on the indirectly on the companies. Those companies who want to bring raw material from abroad, or import the accessories and all, they have to pay the taxes. So that is this is called tax inflation. Wage inflation. If the next one is wage inflation. Yes, it is if the rise in wages is not accompanied by rise in output. So there the prices of goods will be increasing. Now the important concept in the based on causes. Build inflation. Vicious cycle of built-in inflation is induced by adaptive expectations of workers or employees. Those who try to keep their wages or salaries high in anticipation of inflation. So employers and organizations raise the prices of their respective goods and services in anticipation of demands. So this overall builds a vicious cycle of rising wages followed by the rising prices. And the next category is development inflation. During the process of development of an economy, the income increases, causing the increase in demand and rise in prices, and thereby this is known as development inflation. And one of the important other category is fiscal inflation. The fiscal inflation it occurs due to the excess government expenditure or spending when there is a budget deficit. So this is known as fiscal inflation. And the next one is population inflation. Population inflation, yes. The price rises due to a rapid increase in the population is known as population inflation. And the next one is foreign trade inflation, yes. It is divided into two categories, the export boom inflation and the import price hike inflation. When for a particular product there is a boom for exports, automatically even in the local market the price of such products will be increased. Also, when a particular company is importing goods from the foreign countries, then also there is a chance of rising prices for such import goods. Sectoral inflation. Yes, sectoral inflation occurs when there is a rise in the prices of goods and services produced by a particular sector of an industry. For instance, if the prices of crude oil increases, then it will also affect the other sectors like aviation, road transport, etc. So which are directly related to the oil industry. For example, if oil prices are hiked, the air tickets, fares and road transportation costs will also increase. So this is known as sectoral inflation. Now, another important category is demand pull inflation. According to the demand pull theory, the price rise in response to an excessive aggregate demand over the excessive aggregate supply of goods. It is also called as excess demand inflation. So, in the excess demand means aggregate real demand for the output in excess of minimum, maximum feasible or potential full employment. So the demand pull theorists point out that inflation might be caused in the first place by an increase in the quantity of money. The causes of demand pull inflation are increase in investment, increase in money supply, and also increase in the public expenditure. Next one is cost push inflation. Cost push inflation or cost inflation is induced by the wage inflation process. So, this is especially true for a country like India, where the labor intensive techniques are commonly used. The theories of cost push inflation are also called as sellers or markup inflation, came to be put forward after the mid 1950s. They appeared largely in refutation of the demand pull theories and inflation, and there are three important common ingredients of such theories are the upward push in the cost is autonomous of the demand conditions, and the push forces operate through some important cost components such as wages, profits, etc. So, again, finally, the sixth category inflation, types of inflation based on expectation. Inflations based on expectations. You have anticipated. Anticipated inflation. If the rate of inflation corresponds to what the majority of people are predicting, that is called anticipated. On the opposite side, it is unanticipated, unanticipated inflation. Here, if the rate of inflation corresponds to what the majority of people are not expecting or predicting, then it is called unanticipated inflation. So, you have understood the different types of inflation based on coverage. You have comprehensive Spartiak, and based on time of occurrence, you have wartime, post-wartime, and peacetime inflation. Based on government reaction, you have open and suppressed inflation, and based on the rising prices, you have creeping inflation, walking inflation, chronic inflation, moderate inflation, and running inflation, galloping inflation, and now hyperinflation. And based on the causes, you have deficit, credit, scarcity inflations, profit inflation, pricing power inflations, tax inflations, wage inflations, and then built-in inflation, development inflation, fiscal inflation, population inflation, foreign trade inflation, sectoral inflation. And one of the important category in the based on causes are demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. And again on the sixth category, based on expectations, you have anticipated and unanticipated inflations. Thank you.